pray, Lord, that you use this message in our lives. Speak to us, Lord, through this one simple truth that we're going to look at this morning and this evening. And I just pray that you will use it in our lives. In Jesus' name. We all are familiar with the subject of prayer. And as a child of God, you have no doubt prayed many prayers that they just don't seem to be answered the way that you want them to be. I try to think of a cute story that would really illustrate that well. The best one that I can think of is when I was in college. I was praying that God would put me through college. I went 8 years for a 4-year degree. And I was praying that God would put me through college, and I was praying that God would give me the right wife. And I kept coming up short on my school bill. And I kept having to sit out a semester here and sit out a semester there. And I lost some credits that I'd already taken but I couldn't pay for. I got pretty frustrated, and at one point I was walking my dog up in the peninsula of Michigan in between semesters, walking him out in the snow, and I remember looking up at the top of the pine trees and just yelling, "God, where are you?" Because my prayers were not seeming to be answered. But unbeknownst to me, that God could not answer my prayer and put me through college in 4 years. Otherwise, I would not have met and married my wife. And sometimes, here's the issue. Charlie, you probably had to stand too. Try to embarrass her as much as possible. But I thank God for answering my prayer His way instead of the way I wanted it answered. And sometimes we pray for something. We get frustrated with God for the circumstance that we're in. And the problem is we don't see the big picture. Many of you, this must be a Midwestern thing, many of you, I go into your home, and somewhere in your home there is a picture of your house from the air. People fly over and sell pictures, they take pictures and then land in your yard and sell pictures of, I don't know. There seems to be an aerial photo of everybody's house, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you just don't see that. I've never seen that anywhere except for here in the Midwest. So. But you ever notice how different everything looks from up there? And how much more you can see than when you're standing on the ground? And God can see a lot more than us. That was really dramatic and terrible. But God can see far more than we can see. Let me put it that way. From His perspective, and we get a little frustrated because we don't see the big picture like He does, even though He may be answering our prayer more completely than we can imagine. And we wonder if we, in the heat of the moment, we may believe that we cannot trust God with our prayer request. We cannot trust Him with the circumstance that we're in. And I want to kind of attack that subject just a little bit and bring out one quick truth out of this. Is a long story. I'm going to try and make a long story short, but many preachers have said that before. But we're going to be in Lamentations chapter 3. Lamentations chapter 3. And we'll kind of bounce back and forth as this story requires. But Lamentations chapter 3. And this is the story of Jeremiah and a prayer that he prayed. The prayer seemed to be answered for a moment, and then it seemed to fall through. And then Jeremiah, in the end, found that God was in control the whole time. And found that his prayer was answered in a way that he could not anticipate, and in a way that only God could do from His perspective. And so as we look at Jeremiah chapter 3, I want you to look at verse 55. And Jeremiah says this, "I called upon thy name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon. Thou hast heard my voice. Hide not thine ear at my breathing, at my cry. Thou drewest near in the day that I called upon thee. Thou saidst, fear not. O Lord, thou hast pleaded the causes of my soul. Thou hast redeemed my life. Now, what is he talking about here? Jeremiah in verse 55 says, I called on your name, Lord, out of a low dungeon. I know that is sometimes used in the Bible as a figure of speech, but when Jeremiah says that he called upon the Lord's name out of a low dungeon, he's not using a figure of speech. He's speaking about an actual incident in his life where he was lowered into a dungeon. Then I want you to keep a finger here and go back to Jeremiah chapter 37. And I am not going to take the time to read Jeremiah 37 through 39 straight through. Can I get an amen? All right? But I'm going to bring out some of the highlights, and I'm going to try and give you this story in a way that hopefully will convey the main thought of it, and we'll understand what Jeremiah was praying about and what God's answer to his prayer was. In Jeremiah chapter 37, what happens here is Jeremiah was a prophet in the last days of Judah, and during the last part of Judah being still a nation, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, was slowly but surely creeping through northern parts of Judah and approaching the city of Jerusalem to lay siege to it. Jerusalem is a natural fortress, and many people, in spite of Nebuchadnezzar's power, the people of Jerusalem believed that he could not take that city. And they in fact sent ambassadors to Egypt to call the Pharaoh of Egypt to bring his armies up and attack Nebuchadnezzar. And they came out to do that. Jeremiah prophesied during this time. And he was not a popular prophet because he prophesied and predicted that Israel would fall, that Jerusalem would be broken up, that Nebuchadnezzar would come in and destroy that place and kill most of the men and carry them away captive. Now, if you can imagine, if America was at war with an enemy that was right at our gates, about to tear the place down, if a group of people or some person was going around the country and holding large press conferences and declaring how America was going to be defeated in this war, they wouldn't be real popular, would they? They might gain some traction among certain people, but overall, they would probably be considered traitors by most. I'm not talking about having just a different opinion, but people actually working against or perceived to work against the United States of America in a war effort. This is what Jeremiah was perceived as. As the enemy closed in, Jeremiah took to the streets of Jerusalem and began to preach a message saying, listen, if you will defect from the army, if you will leave this place and go out to our enemies and surrender to them, then you're going to live. That was his message. If not, if you stay here and defend it, then you're going to die or be carried away captive. Now, could you imagine what the response to that message was? It was not a good response. And so Babylon comes, and Nebuchadnezzar comes with his army, and he lays siege to the city. And as that grand army is outside the gates of the city, Jeremiah's prophecy is looking pretty good. It's looking pretty true. But then if we look here in verse 3 of chapter 37, and Zedekiah the king sent to Jubal the son of Shelemiah and Zephaniah the son of Maaseiah the priest to the prophet Jeremiah, saying, pray now unto the Lord our God for us. Now Jeremiah came in and went out among the people, for they had not put him in prison. Then Pharaoh's army was come up forth out of Egypt. And when the Chaldeans that besieged Jerusalem heard tidings of them, they departed from Jerusalem. Then came the word of the Lord unto the prophet Jeremiah, saying, thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, thus shall ye say to the king of Judah, that sent you unto me to inquire of me, behold, Pharaoh's army, which has come forth to help you, shall return to Egypt in their own land, and the Chaldeans shall come again and fight against this city and take it and burn it with fire. So here's the scene, all right? The Chaldeans have besieged the city. Zedekiah the king sends to Jeremiah and asks him to pray to God, asks him to pray to Yahweh for him. Now, these guys didn't believe just in God, but they were trying to get as much prayer out there as they could. And so they asked this of Jeremiah the prophet, and Jeremiah says, don't be fooled. They're leaving now. The Egyptians have come up, but the Egyptians are going to go back. They're going to defeat the Egyptians. They're going to come back. They're going to break up this city. Don't be fooled by this. And so he gives that prophecy, and the Chaldeans leave. And as they leave, Jeremiah sees his chance, and he decides, I'm not going to be in this city when they come back to destroy it. I'm not taking my chances. So he leaves the city. And on his way out, as he gets out a little bit, he gets caught by someone in the army, a captain. And if you look in look at the end of verse 13, this captain in the army says, he took Jeremiah the prophet, saying, thou fallest away to the Chaldeans. He's saying, you're a traitor. You've been prophesying. Now you've got your chance. You're leaving the city. You're one of them. Jeremiah denies it, but of course, he didn't really get due process, I don't think. And so, verse 15, wherefore the princes were wroth with Jeremiah and smote him, and put him into prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they had made that the prison, when Jeremiah was entered into the dungeon and into the cabins. And Jeremiah had remained there many days. So Jeremiah let's see, I lost my place. All right, he's accused of treason. He's put in prison, and not just in prison. He's put in a dungeon. This would be just a hole in the ground in the bottom of the prison somewhere. Right? This is a nasty place. Not a lot of ventilation. Very musty. Not good for you. Usually when you put someone in a dungeon, they were going there either for a couple of days to really cool off or to die. And so he lays there, or he's there in the dungeon 3 days, and the king comes back and calls him out and talks to him and asks him some advice. Again, Jeremiah tells him to surrender. And then after the king asks him some advice, he puts him back in the prison, but not in the dungeon. So he's just in the regular prison now. But then these princes, you would call these guys maybe the king's cabinet, they hear that Jeremiah is out of the dungeon and that he's in a regular prison. Not a good thing either, but he's not where they put him. And so, and he's again prophesying for people and telling them, instructing them to go surrender to the Chaldeans who have come back. Look at verse 4 of chapter 38, the accusation they bring against Jeremiah. Therefore the princes said to the king, we beseech thee, let this man be put to death. For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of this people, but the hurt. Then Zedekiah the king said, behold, he's in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. Then in verse 6, then they took Jeremiah and cast him in the dungeon of Malchiah. This is a different dungeon, all right? They cast him in the dungeon of Malchiah, the son of Hemelech, that was in the court of the prison, and they let down Jeremiah with cords. And in the dungeon there was no water but mire. So Jeremiah sunk. Jeremiah sunk in that mire. Now, if you can imagine this, there was nothing but muck and slime in the bottom. They lowered him down in that, and it was not a solid floor. And it's at this point in Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 55, Jeremiah calls out to the Lord out of the low dungeon. And he asks God to save his life because he's there to die. They didn't put him there to cool him off for a little bit. In fact, the princes said to the king back here that they asked him, they said, we beseech thee, let this man be put to death, in verse 4. And their manner of execution was to leave him in this dungeon, down in the mire, sinking in that mud. And Jeremiah is there calling to God, Lord, save my life. Get me out of this prison. And he prays. And see, the princes had accused him of treason, and he was in jail for that and into prison. He didn't kill. Now, let's look at God's answer. Right? Here's the prayer. Lord, I'm in this dungeon. Probably a little more desperate than this. I'm not a good actor. He said, Lord, I'm in this dungeon. I'm going to die. I'm cold. I have no food. I'm left here alone, sinking in this mire. I can't imagine anything worse. And he's calling out to God to save him. Verse 7 of chapter 38. God sends part of an answer. Now when Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs, which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, and the king then, sitting in the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-melech went forth out of the king's house and spake to the king, saying, My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he's like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. The king commanded Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, saying, Take from hence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. And we'll stop reading there. But basically, this Ethiopian eunuch, the servant in the palace, finds out about Jeremiah's condition. He goes to the king and petitions the king. And he says, look, they're going to kill Jeremiah. I don't know if the king had that in mind or not. The king, this king is not a very strong-willed king. Whoever comes to him, he just says, do whatever. And he goes to the king. The king sends him with 30 men. What they do is they let down ropes, put him under his arms, and they drag him out. Now Jeremiah's been rescued from prison, right? That's his prayer. But the circumstance doesn't turn out the way he wants it to right away. See, Jeremiah is taken out of the dungeon. But if you look at chapter 38 and verse 28, for sake of time, we'll skip some details. It says in verse 28, So Jeremiah abode in the court of the prison until the day that Jerusalem was taken. And he was there when Jerusalem was taken. So he's rescued from prison. The king again brings him to the house of the Lord, and he asks him questions. And again, Jeremiah gives him the same advice: surrender and you'll live. The king won't do that. And he says, Now, Jeremiah, if any of the princes ask you what we're talking about, just tell them that you were asking permission to get out of the jail. And so Jeremiah, I don't know why, but he tells this story to the princes. When they come to him, and they throw him back in prison. Not in the dungeon, but he's in prison. He got out of the dungeon, but he never gained his freedom. Now, if you were Jeremiah, if I were Jeremiah, I'd be sitting there looking up at the stars, if I could see stars, and saying, God, where are you? I have no justice. I have no freedom. I've tried to do what you want me to do. I've tried to do right, and this is the answer to my prayer, prison bars. God, where are you? And so he prayed to God out of that dungeon. Got out of the dungeon, but still in prison. It seemed like God didn't have a complete answer for Jeremiah, but the truth is, that prison was his answer. In chapter 39 of Jeremiah, again, we will not read for all of it, but what happens in chapter 39 is after 2 years of laying siege to Jerusalem. Now, Jeremiah's been in prison for 2 years. Think about that. That is a long time for not even committing a crime. Not even being really accused of much of a crime. And he's in prison for 2 years after praying to God to save his life out of that dungeon. After 2 years, the walls are broken down. Nebuchadnezzar's armies come spilling in and destroying and killing and capturing. The king, Zedekiah, and his mighty men escape by night out of breaching the wall, but they're caught up to. Nebuchadnezzar brings Zedekiah before him, and in front of King Zedekiah, he kills his entire family. The Bible says slain his son. And then the last thing they did is they put out Zedekiah's eyes so that he would never see another thing. The last thing he witnessed on this earth was the slaying of his family. And meantime, as they're doing it, this was a cruel enemy. But when they come to Jeremiah, they find him in prison. And as they're slaying prophets, and they're killing nobles, and they're taking out all the people they think might be a threat to their empire in Jerusalem, they come upon a lowly prisoner. And it's interesting what happens. In verse 6 of chapter 30, I'm sorry, not verse 6, verse 11 of chapter 39. Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, Take him, and look well to him, and do him no harm, but do unto him even as he shall say to thee. Verse 14, Even they sent and took Jeremiah out of the court of the prison, and committed him to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, that he should carry him whole. And he dwelt among the people. Amazing. Now, what was Jeremiah's prayer request? Back in Lamentations chapter 3, verse 55. I called unto thy name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon. Thou heard my voice. Hide not my ear from my breathing at my cry. Thou drawest near in the day that I called on thee. Thou said, Fear not. O Lord, thou hast pleaded the causes of my soul. Thou hast redeemed my life. Jeremiah is looking back on this incident and saying, God, you saved my life. I prayed for it. I didn't understand it for 2 years in prison. I didn't understand it. But God put him in prison so that when Jerusalem fell, Jeremiah would be where God would protect him. God heard him, comforted him, saved his life by keeping him in that prison. And here we come to the crux of the matter. I say all of that to say this. All this story is to say this. If you can trust God in prayer, you can trust him with your present circumstances. You may pray a prayer and may be begging God for something, and maybe you don't see the immediate result. Maybe you don't see what you want in that prayer. Maybe for a long time you don't understand it, but you cannot see what God sees. You do not understand what God understands. And just like Jeremiah was pulled out of the miry clay, God saved him there, but put in prison for 2 years so that God could accomplish the second part of his prayer. Lord, redeem my life. And he did. Redeem his life. You know, sometimes we may be running late for you could be running late for a meeting or for work and say, God, help me get there on time, and you're there late anyway. You can stop by a train or something like that, but just to have that train someone pulled out that you would have hit if you were there. God works in mysterious ways. If you can trust him with your prayer, you can trust him with your present circumstances. Whatever's going on in your life, whatever you're praying about, whatever weighs heavy on you, weighs heavy on the Lord's heart. He doesn't. You're not in a position where he can't hear you. If he heard Jeremiah in a lowly dungeon, as they come to bring the invitation hymn, I want you to remember that you can trust God in prayer, and you can trust God, you can trust Christ with your present circumstances. You know, the disciples thought that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven in their minds was right around the corner. And then Jesus died. They were waiting for Jesus to save them. Yet he died. And that was not on their agenda. But in dying, in doing what they thought was failure, he saved them for all eternity, not just a little bit of time. We can trust God in prayer. We can trust him with our present circumstances.